Drifting alone through the darkness of space, a small capsule traverses the void. On board, the two pioneers prepare for the next step of their voyage. Mere hours ago, history had been made. For the first time, astronauts had launched into orbit in a commercially built spacecraft, the first crewed launch from the United States in nearly a decade. Looking down from orbit, they carried the hopes and dreams of a whole world, knowing that this was just the beginning. Countless worlds would soon be explored, igniting a vibrant future amongst the stars. In today's Mars mission update, we're going to be taking a look at what comes next for human spaceflight after the first crewed Dragon launch by NASA and SpaceX. We'll cover the commercialization of low Earth orbit, the ongoing endeavours to build starships in Texas, the plan to return astronauts to the moon in a sustainable way, and finally how all these ingredients will enable the first human missions to the Red Planet. On May 30th, 2020, NASA astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken were strapped into a SpaceX Dragon capsule atop a Falcon 9 rocket. With their successful launch into orbit, one day later they docked with the International Space Station. But this was not just any routine mission. It was the first launch of astronauts by a private company and the return of human spaceflight to the United States after the retirement of the Space Shuttle back in 2011. This mission, known as Demo 2, marks the culmination of NASA's Commercial Crew Program. The central goal of Commercial Crew is to reduce the cost of sending astronauts to space by commercializing low Earth orbit. The idea being that this would free up NASA's resources to focus on missions to deep space. Back in 2012, a similar initiative, the Commercial Cargo or COTS program, saw a commercially built and operated spacecraft, SpaceX's Dragon, begin regular resupply missions to the International Space Station. Building on the success of Commercial Cargo, in 2014, NASA awarded commercial crew contracts to two companies, SpaceX with a $2.6 billion contract and Boeing with $4.2 billion. Each company was tasked with building a crew-capable spacecraft, flying two demonstration missions, and beginning astronaut transport services to the International Space Station. Though the first crewed flights were initially planned for 2017, the Commercial Crew Program is finally reaching fruition. SpaceX developed the Dragon 2, called Crew Dragon in its astronaut configuration, which saw its first flight to the space station, the uncrewed Demo 1 mission, in March 2019. They followed this with a successful in-flight abort test in January 2020, where a Dragon demonstrated its ability to escape from a malfunctioning Falcon 9 and return safely to Earth. Most recently, of course, we all saw the incredible launch of the crewed Demo 2 mission. Meanwhile, the other partner in the Commercial Crew Program, Boeing, remains around a year away from flying astronauts. Boeing's Starliner capsule conducted its first orbital test flight in December 2019, launching on an Atlas V rocket. Unfortunately, multiple software issues during the mission required it to abandon docking with the space station and instead return to Earth. Boeing are now planning to repeat this with an uncrewed test flight in November, with a crewed demonstration flight following, if all goes well, early next year. So what comes next for the Commercial Crew Program? Well, first Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken will complete an operational mission aboard the space station. Their mission will last for 1 to 4 months, with the limiting factor being the timescale for degradation of the Dragon's solar arrays due to atomic oxygen in the upper atmosphere, which restricts this flight to a maximum of 120 days. Once their mission is complete, they will board the Dragon, detach from the space station, enter the Earth's atmosphere, deploy parachutes, and finally splash down in the Atlantic Ocean, completing the Demo 2 mission. The Dragon capsule will then be refurbished and prepared to fly again for a future mission. With the completion of Demo 2, SpaceX will be fully certified to regularly fly astronauts for NASA. The first operational flight, called Crew 1, will be a 6-month mission to the space station, targeting a launch on August 30th, 2020. Crew 1 will carry a complement of 4 astronauts, 3 being American and 1 Japanese. Looking ahead, from the Crew 2 mission early next year onwards, Russian astronauts are expected to start joining Dragon flights. It's worth pausing for a moment to reflect on just how good a deal Commercial Crew has been. Since 2011, NASA has spent $6.2 billion on Commercial Crew. In comparison, the development of the Apollo Command Module cost $31 billion after adjusting for inflation, while developing the Space Shuttle Orbiter cost $27 billion. So for 1/5 the cost of these programs, NASA helped develop 2 new human-capable spacecraft. And this capability will only save more money with each launch, because for the last 9 years, NASA has paid the Russian Space Agency an average of $80 million per seat for Soyuz flights to the space station, while SpaceX's Crew Dragon flights will be much cheaper at $55 million per seat. Commercial Crew has also provided valuable experience for SpaceX, because NASA's stringent safety requirements specified no more than a 1 in 270 probability of a loss of crew event. This is over 3 times safer than the Space Shuttle. Crew Dragon itself achieved a rating of 1 in 276, with most of the remaining risks coming from the chance of space debris or micrometeorite collisions in orbit. So SpaceX have created the safest spacecraft in history. And because this is a commercially owned spacecraft, they are also free to sell Crew Dragon flights to other customers, opening up access to low Earth orbit in an unprecedented manner. For example, in February, the company Space Adventures reached a deal to fly up to 4 space tourists on a Crew Dragon in late 2021 or early 2022. This 3 to 5 day mission would reach a maximum altitude of over 1,000 kilometers, 2 to 3 times higher than the International Space Station, with the participants observing Earth at a distance not seen since the Gemini 11 mission in 1966. Space Adventures are certainly no stranger to space tourism, having facilitated the flight of the first space tourist, Dennis Tito, to the space station, and flights for 6 others since. Space Adventures are currently in discussion with several interested people, with the price per seat estimated to be less than $50 million. The commercialization of low Earth orbit will not just be confined to trips to space, as NASA has long-term plans to open up the International Space Station itself to commercial activities. Earlier this year, NASA selected the company Axiom Space to design, build and launch 3 modules and an Earth observation window to the space station. These modules will provide habitation for astronauts and tourists, host research and manufacturing facilities, and test critical systems for future deep space missions. Axiom will start by flying one of their own professional astronauts and 3 private astronauts on a minimum 8-day Crew Dragon mission to the space station in the second half of 2021. They plan to launch their first module in the latter half of 2024, attaching to the forward end of the space station, with the commercial extension modules fully assembled in 2028. Once the space station retires, towards the end of the decade, the Axiom modules are planned to detach, forming a standalone commercial space station in Earth orbit. But low Earth orbit is just the beginning. If we want to go beyond Earth and go sustainably, we need to scale up our space endeavours. We need larger spacecraft, capable of carrying more cargo and more people, if we truly desire to live on other worlds. And this is where Starship comes in. Starship is SpaceX's next-generation launch system, a 2-stage, fully reusable rocket capable of carrying over 100 tons of cargo, or up to 100 people, to a variety of destinations in our solar system. The Starship system has 2 parts: a lower booster called Super Heavy, designed to autonomously return to its launch site during flight to enable rapid reuse, and an upper stage spacecraft called Starship, the namesake of the system. Standing 120 meters tall, the Starship system will be the world's most powerful rocket, with twice the thrust of the Saturn V moon rocket, while costing only $2 million per launch due to rapid reusability. The upper stage is the current focus of SpaceX's design and prototype work. As currently envisioned, it will have 2 configurations: cargo and crew. The cargo configuration takes advantage of the large payload volume, 1100 cubic meters, over 7 times that of the Falcon 9, to enable a wide range of mission profiles. Once in orbit, Cargo Starship can open its payload fairing like a clamshell, deploying a single payload of up to 9 meters in diameter, or multiple payloads via a rotating deployment mechanism. Cargo starships could also be used as orbital fuel repositories, whereby starships bound for deep space missions can dock to them end to end to refuel before departing on their journey. But one application I'm especially excited by is the prospect of launching large space telescopes. I will be analysing data from the James Webb Space Telescope when it launches next year in order to examine the composition of exoplanet atmospheres. And while James Webb will be able to probe rocky planet atmospheres, the amount of time required to search for signatures of life in habitable planet atmospheres can easily add up to many hundreds of hours. So James Webb will only be able to look for life in a small number of planet atmospheres over its mission lifetime. If we want to increase our chance of finding life in the universe, we need larger telescopes, which have a higher sensitivity due to their greater collecting area. One such proposal is the Large Ultraviolet Optical and Infrared Surveyor, LUVOIR, a potential successor to James Webb, which could launch around 2035. LUVOIR would be a space-based telescope up to 15 meters in diameter, enabling an extensive search for life on 54 Earth-like planets, and detailed studies of over 500 non-habitable planets over the course of its mission. If you're interested in learning more about LUVOIR, I've added some links down below in the description. But due to its large size, no rockets currently in service can launch LUVOIR. However, the 9-meter diameter fairing of Starship would easily be able to accommodate LUVOIR in a folded configuration, with the telescope deploying into its final 15-meter operational size after launch. Though LUVOIR is one of a number of concepts currently being considered by NASA, its compatibility with the reusable Starship system would serve to lower the launch cost and reduce the overall complexity of this mission. Besides launching cargo, Starship also has a crew configuration. Crew starships can accommodate up to 100 people for long-duration missions to the Moon, Mars, and perhaps beyond. They will include private cabins, large common areas, central storage, solar storm shelters, and a large viewing gallery. This may sound a little like science fiction, but SpaceX have already made extraordinary progress in building and testing the first Starship prototypes. SpaceX started building a scaled-down prototype of Starship called Starhopper in December 2018. A period of testing began in March 2019, seeing a tethered hop in April, a 20-meter hop in July, and finally a 150-meter hop in August 2019. These hop tests also saw the first in-flight usage of SpaceX's Raptor engines, developed specifically for Starship and Super Heavy. The next step was to build and test full-scale Starship prototypes. SpaceX initially built 2 vehicles, called Mark 1 and Mark 2, starting in February and May of 2019. The Mark 1 vehicle was assembled over the course of 8 months at SpaceX's Boca Chica facility in Texas, before it was ultimately destroyed during a pressurization test in November 2019. Around the same time, it was recognised that the Mark II vehicle, which had started construction in Cocoa, Florida in May of 2019, was not flight-worthy and so was discontinued. Recognising that these first prototypes took far too long to build, SpaceX's focus in the first half of 2020 has been the creation and optimisation of a Starship production line at their Boca Chica site. Back in January, the Boca Chica shipyard consisted of a large onion tent, a small tent, a windbreaker, and a workshop. Fast forward 5 months to June, and the site had undergone a colossal expansion in its production and manufacturing capabilities. The Starship assembly area principally consists of a series of large tents, in which stainless steel cylindrical rings, fuel tanks, and nose cones are produced. A linear flow of these components from tent to tent moves each part of the Starship along an assembly line, progressively growing the prototype structure, culminating with vertical stacking and integration in the high bay. This remarkably efficient assembly line has managed to cut the production time for Starship prototypes from 8 months down to just 3 to 4 weeks for the most recent builds. SpaceX are now working to further optimise this pipeline, potentially down to 1 Starship per week by the end of the year, and ultimately to a rate of 1 Starship every 72 hours. The rapid expansion of Starship assembly operations has also been enabled by a large increase in the number of workers on the site. From around a dozen workers in early 2019, the Boca Chica site expanded to over 500 employees by February and is now just shy of 1,000 workers, potentially growing to as many as 3,000 employees by early next year. The core reasoning behind the new buildings and mass hirings in Boca Chica is to implement a simple design philosophy. A high production rate enables a high iteration rate. With each new Starship prototype being rapidly assembled, SpaceX can continually improve the design using lessons from those that came before. So once a prototype is complete, the next step is to transport it around 3 kilometers up the road to the Starship launch and landing site, now being used as the Starship testing area. The main constituents of the test site are a stand where Starship prototypes are mounted for tests, a farm of tanks containing liquid nitrogen, liquid methane and liquid oxygen, the old Starhopper prototype, now serving as a mount for cameras and a radar system, also a flare stack to burn excess methane, and finally a launch pad under development from where the combined Starship and Super Heavy rocket will eventually lift off from. Now that we've seen how the Starship assembly line works, let's take a look at the progress the Starship testing program has made so far in 2020. Using lessons learned from Mark 1 and Mark 2, SpaceX started building the Mark 3 Starship, later renamed SN1, or serial number 1, in October 2019. The SN1 design was a marked improvement, weighing 20% less than the Mark 1, but ultimately succumbed to a similar fate when its tanks were pressurized with cryogenic liquid nitrogen in February 2020. These cryogenic tests would prove the bane of early Starship prototypes. In the case of SN1, the root cause of the failure was some bad stainless steel welds in the thrust puck, a structure near the base of the lower fuel tank where the engines would eventually be mounted. Over the course of a month, a small test tank called SN2 was built to try out a solution. A full redesign of the thrust puck for SN2 ultimately resolved the issue, with the tank passing a cryogenic pressure test in March 2020. SN2 was then retired, with SpaceX returning to work on full-scale Starship prototypes. Hopes were high with the construction of SN3 in March, which went to the test stand in April, but alas, the cryogenic curse returned once more, albeit via a different failure mode. While both the lower and upper tanks were being pressurized with liquid nitrogen, a valve inadvertently released pressure from the lower tank, causing SN3 to crumple due to the weight of the pressurized upper tank. Unlike the previous structural failures with Mark 1 and SN1, the failure of SN3 was simply a test configuration error, which was quick to rectify. Just 3 weeks after the demise of SN3, in late April, SpaceX began testing their next prototype, SN4. On April 26th, SN4 became the first full-scale Starship prototype to survive the dreaded cryogenic pressure test, having been pressurized to 4.9 bar with liquid nitrogen. The tank pressure required for an operational flight is 6 bar, a target exceeded by a second cryogenic test on May 9th, which reached 7.5 bar. Cryogenic pressurization is the first of 3 main stages in testing a Starship prototype. The second stage is a series of static fires, whereby a Raptor engine attached to the prototype undergoes a burn while the Starship is fixed in place. Finally, if all goes well with the static fires, the prototype moves to flight tests with ever-increasing altitudes, much like we saw with the Starhopper. SN4 successfully completed its first static fire test on May 5th, becoming the first full-scale Starship to be tested with a Raptor engine. 4 further static fire tests took place over the course of May, testing 2 different Raptor engines, while accruing a wealth of data on the performance of the vehicle and the engine. But unfortunately, shortly after the 5th static fire, on May 29th, a liquid methane leak near the base of the vehicle caused a catastrophic explosion, which engulfed SN4 in flames, leaving behind the smouldering remains of this pioneering prototype. This recent failure was an unfortunate setback, especially given that SN4 had been expected to attempt a 150-metre hop test shortly afterwards. But nevertheless, the delay is likely to be marginal, as the next prototype is more or less complete. Starship SN5 started construction in April and is already fully stacked, bar the potential addition of a nose cone. As SN5 becomes the focus of testing in the weeks to come, construction will continue on SN6, which began production in April. At the same time, another small test tank, SN7, has just finished construction and moved to the test site. SN7 has been built from a different stainless steel alloy than previous prototypes, 304L instead of 301, so testing this prototype should elucidate the ideal material properties to pursue before SpaceX ultimately shifts to a custom steel alloy in the future. So what can we expect to see in the Starship program this year? Well, with reconstruction of a test stand essentially complete, we should first see SN5 roll out to the test stand and commence cryogenic pressure testing and static fires. If these tests succeed, SN5 would then move ahead with a 150-metre hop with a single Raptor engine. The next milestone will be a 20-kilometre suborbital hop, for which the Federal Aviation Administration has already granted approval. Such a hop will require a Starship prototype equipped with 3 Raptor engines and fins, which we could see accomplished with the SN6 prototype a few months down the line. The ultimate goal of this year's testing program would be a 100-kilometre orbital flight of a Starship prototype. This is certainly an ambitious goal, which would require the construction and testing of super heavy boosters before it could proceed, none of which have yet been built. But this being said, super heavy ring segments would employ the exact same build techniques and facilities as the Starship prototypes. If SpaceX are to remain on track for an orbital flight this year, we should expect to see super heavy prototypes sometime in the second half of this year, perhaps undergoing tests with a reduced complement of Raptor engines. And though this timeline is clearly unmatched in its ambition, and some slips are to be expected, one thing is for certain: when the day finally comes where a Starship soars into the sky over Texas, a new era in spaceflight will begin. And from that day on, we will have unlocked the limitless potential of our solar system. So now that we've seen the near-term future of human spaceflight in low Earth orbit, and the progress of the next generation Starship system, let's turn to the next great endeavour in human spaceflight: the return of astronauts to the moon. 1 year ago, NASA announced the Artemis Program, a 21st century initiative to enable human exploration and development of the moon. The headline goals of Artemis are to achieve a human landing near the moon's south pole by 2024 and establish an outpost on the moon from 2028. Unlike the Apollo program, Artemis has been designed from the get-go to be sustainable, using public-private partnerships, similar to the Commercial Crew program, to minimise the overall cost of this endeavour. The Artemis program begins with the Artemis 1 mission. In late 2021, NASA's new Space Launch System, or SLS rocket, will launch an uncrewed Orion crew capsule on a 26 to 42 day mission to loop around the moon and return to Earth. A year later, in late 2022 or early 2023, the Artemis 2 mission will see a crewed flight of Orion on a free return trajectory around the moon. Both Artemis 1 and Artemis 2 will verify the hardware and software of Orion in advance of expanded human operations at the moon. Around the same time as Artemis 1 and 2, from 2021, NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services, or CLPS initiative, will start sending robotic missions to the moon. The goal of CLPS is to test landing technology, conduct surface science, scout for lunar resources, and demonstrate in situ resource utilization in preparation for human landings. CLPS follows a similar model to the Commercial Cargo Program for the International Space Station, where NASA will contract private companies to launch and land the payloads on the lunar surface. One of the most important early CLPS missions will be Viper, a rover mission which will land in the lunar South Pole region in 2023. Why is this region the focus of the Artemis program? Well, in 2008 and 2009, both India's Chandrayaan-1 mission and NASA's LCROSS mission deployed impactor probes in the South Polar region, with the resulting ejecta indicating millions of tons of water ice must lie in shadow craters near the South Pole. So we know the water ice is there on the moon, but many of its properties remain unknown. The goal of Viper is to measure the depth, purity, and distribution of water ice over a 100-day mission, because to build a sustainable presence on the moon, we will need to understand how to use such ice deposits to produce breathable oxygen, rocket propellant, and perhaps drinkable water. With these early missions complete, the stage will be set for the first human landing on the moon in over 50 years. In 2024, the Artemis 3 mission will see an Orion capsule launch to the moon. In lunar orbit, 2 of the crew members will transfer into a human landing system, detach from Orion, and descend to the lunar surface. Artemis 3 will be a huge milestone for human spaceflight, seeing the first woman walk on the moon and the first human landing in the South Polar region. The 2 astronauts will stay on the surface for 6.5 days and conduct 4 surface excursions of up to 6 hours each, before launching from the surface to redock with Orion and return to Earth. One of the key elements required to accomplish Artemis 3 is the human landing system. In April, NASA announced 3 companies will share nearly $1 billion to design potential human-rated landers over a 10-month period: Dynetics, the National Team Collaboration, and SpaceX. In November, NASA will start evaluating each design, ultimately deciding whether to down-select to 2 providers or keep 3 in February 2021. So let's take a look at these 3 proposed human landing systems and how they will work. Dynetics are designing a 2-stage lander called Alpaca, which would launch from Earth uncrewed on a United Launch Alliance Vulcan rocket. Alpaca uses 2 drop tanks to fuel its engines, which are jettisoned prior to touching down on the lunar surface. The national team, led by Blue Origin, will see Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Draper combine their expertise to design a 3-stage lunar lander. The lander itself is a variant of the Blue Moon lander, announced last year by Blue Origin, which notably uses liquid hydrogen and oxygen to power its BE-7 engines. These fuels can be produced by electrolyzing ice deposits, allowing the vehicle to refuel using local lunar resources before taking off from the surface. Finally, SpaceX are planning to use a specially adapted lunar lander variant of Starship. Comparing this with the base Starship design on the right, the Lunar Starship has no heat shield or fins, a curved solar array near its tip, integrated landing legs, and white paint for enhanced reflectivity. The Lunar Starship also features triple thruster engines higher up its body, minimizing the effect of regolith kickback during landing. Once landed, cargo or up to 4 astronauts can leave the 2 airlocks 26 meters above the surface and be taken by a crane system guided by rails down to the ground. One key advantage of the Starship system is the large amount of cargo it can deliver, opening the possibility of ambitious lunar base architectures. So now that we've seen how SpaceX are poised to play a critical role in NASA's efforts to return to the moon, let's go back to our Starship timeline to see precisely how they plan to support the Artemis program. For reference, I've added the tentative dates for the first 3 Artemis missions to the timeline. SpaceX have proposed a series of milestones to prove the fidelity of the Starship system. Once orbital flight of a Starship prototype has been achieved, they will demonstrate end-to-end propellant transfer in orbit. Other milestones include a long-duration orbital flight test, the reflight of a landed Starship, and a Starship flight beyond low Earth orbit. Note that the precise dates of these milestones will be largely contingent on how the testing program in Boca Chica proceeds, so their position and ordering on this timeline should be viewed as illustrative, within around a 1-year uncertainty window. With these tests complete, SpaceX will aim to land an uncrewed Starship on the moon in 2022 and complete a flyby around the moon with Japanese billionaire Yusaku Maezawa as part of the privately funded Dear Moon mission in 2023. Following all these steps, SpaceX will have proved the reliability of the Starship system to support the Artemis 3 landing in 2024. From then, the focus of the Artemis program will transition to establishing a sustained human presence on and around the moon. There are two key components to this plan: the Lunar Gateway and Artemis Base Camp. Gateway will be a small station in orbit around the moon, serving as a staging post for astronauts moving to and from the lunar surface and a platform for detailed scientific investigations beyond Earth's Van Allen radiation belts. The nucleus of Gateway, consisting of an integrated power and propulsion element, along with a habitation module, is planned to launch in November 2023 on a commercial rocket, probably the Falcon Heavy, but this will be decided later in the year. The Gateway nucleus will use solar electric propulsion to maneuver to lunar orbit over the course of 9 to 10 months, arriving in the second half of 2024. If ready in time, Gateway could potentially provide communications relay support for Artemis 3, but currently it is envisioned to mostly support yearly landings from the Artemis 4 mission in 2025 onwards. Building on the collaboration at the heart of the International Space Station, many countries will work alongside the US to expand the capabilities of Gateway with additional modules. In particular, the European and Japanese space agencies plan to contribute an international habitation module. Canada will be providing an external robotic arm, and Russia is interested in providing an airlock. These international additions are currently envisioned to be complete by around 2028, with the final configuration of Gateway designed for a 15-year lifespan. Much like the International Space Station today, keeping Gateway well supplied will be vital to maintaining its science operations and support capabilities for human crews. For this, NASA will offer Gateway Logistics Services contracts to the private sector, following the same model as the space station's Commercial Cargo Program. These resupply contracts will be worth up to $7 billion over a 12 to 15-year timeframe, shared between multiple contractors. The first award was announced in March, given to SpaceX to design a new vehicle called Dragon XL. This will be a variant of the Cargo Dragon capsule, launching on SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket and capable of transporting more than 5 tons of cargo, experiments and supplies to Gateway. Once it arrives, Dragon XL will spend 6 to 12 months docked to Gateway before autonomously maneuvering to a lunar graveyard orbit. When you combine Dragon XL, the Lunar Starship, and Falcon Heavy launches for the CLIPS program, it becomes clear that SpaceX is set to play a critical role in NASA's efforts to return to the moon. Alongside Gateway, lunar surface operations will expand dramatically from 2025, with the establishment of the Artemis Base Camp. This consists of 3 components: the Lunar Terrain Vehicle, the Habitable Mobility Platform, and the Foundation Surface Habitat. The Lunar Terrain Vehicle will extend the range of human surface exploration, being capable of transporting 2 astronauts and materials weighing 500 kilograms for at least 2 kilometers. Next, the Habitable Mobility Platform will be a pressurized rover capable of extending human expeditions to tens of kilometers from the landing site, and extending surface durations from a week to 30 to 45 days. Finally, the Foundational Surface Habitat will support up to 4 crew members for stays of up to 2 months. These initial components of the Artemis Base Camp are envisioned to be in place by 2028. Though a specific site for the base has yet to be determined, promising locations could be near crater rims at the lunar South Pole, some of which receive sunlight for 80% of the year, helping to reduce temperature extremes and maximise solar power potential. During stays at the base, astronauts will test new technologies, including surface power systems, in situ resource utilisation, excavation and construction techniques, and lunar dust mitigation. Over time, the base will be expanded to add communication systems, a lightweight fission power system, radiation shielding, waste disposal, and a landing pad. One possibility that I'm especially excited by is the prospect of remotely operating a lunar radio telescope on the far side of the moon from the Artemis base. In April, NASA selected an idea along just these lines for a Phase 1 Innovative Advanced Concept Study. The central case is that radio wavelengths longer than around 10 meters are incredibly difficult to study from Earth's surface because they are reflected off the ionosphere. But a radio observatory on the moon would have no such problems, opening a new window on the universe. For example, such a telescope would be able to measure the magnetic field strength of exoplanets by searching for their corresponding radio emission. At the end of the day, One of the central goals of all this lunar infrastructure is to develop technologies and learn lessons which can be directly applied to human missions to Mars. One proposal is to add a large inflatable habitat to Gateway to simulate a Mars mission. This would see 4 astronauts spend a few months living in this habitat, simulating the outbound trip to Mars before 2 crew members descend to the lunar surface to visit the base camp for surface operations, after which they would return to the Gateway and spend another few months in the inflatable habitat to simulate the return to Earth. So now that we've seen the future of human spaceflight in low Earth orbit, the development of the Starship vehicle, and the plans to sustainably return to the Moon, let's finally take a look at how all these will come together to enable human missions to Mars. If we want to land the first people on Mars within this decade, the only vehicle which will have the necessary capabilities and be ready on time will be SpaceX's Starship system. Indeed, the founding principle behind the Starship project was to enable a self-sufficient society on Mars. SpaceX's Mars mission architecture follows a series of 6 steps. We've already seen the process of launching a Starship into orbit and landing the Super Heavy booster along with on-orbit refueling. For a Mars mission, with a surface payload of up to 100 tons, as many as 4 tanker Starships will be involved in refueling operations, after which the Starship or group of Starships depart on a multi-month transfer to Mars. On arrival, the Starship plummets into the Martian atmosphere, orienting itself to maximise its surface area and increase drag. The heat from this supersonic entry is absorbed by the hexagonal heat shield tiles on the underside of the vehicle. After surviving atmospheric entry, the Starship falls like a skydiver, with the wings and fins helping control the descent. Finally, it reorients itself vertically and ignites its Raptor engines to arrive at the landing site. The target landing site will most likely be Arcadia Planitia, as discussed in detail in my October Mars mission update last year. Once landed, each Starship can connect to a propellant plant which produces the liquid methane and liquid oxygen fuel for the Raptor engines from ice deposits and carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere. This enables Starships to readily return to Earth once refueled. To chart a course for the first human Mars missions, let's go back to our Starship timeline and add the Earth-Mars launch windows which occur every 26 months. The first goal will be to send 2 uncrewed cargo Starships to Mars, aiming to confirm water ice resources, identify hazards, and place basic infrastructure including power, mining, and life support systems. Starship's large payload capacity has clear advantages over any other system currently in development for such a mission, as it increases redundancy by allowing multiple instances of vital hardware to be brought along and allows for large-scale future expansion to be planned from the very first mission. SpaceX has been targeting 2022 for this cargo opportunity for many years now, but given this is only 2 years away, and SpaceX may want to apply lessons from their Lunar Starship missions, I've added a 5-year uncertainty window to the timeline to cover the possibility of slips by 2 launch windows. If all goes well with the cargo mission, it will be followed in the next launch window by the first human mission to Mars. This would see 2 crew Starships, each carrying 20 to 50 people, and 2 cargo Starships land in separated locations within a few kilometers of each other. This suggests that a heavy cargo and crew transportation rover will need to be developed, perhaps similar to the habitable mobility platform envisioned for the Artemis base camp. The priority of this mission will be to make operational a propellant production plant to refuel the Starships. The crewed mission will also focus on establishing the infrastructure of Mars Base Alpha, including habitats, radiation shelters, greenhouses, and landing pads. The plan is for the first 5 Starships to stay on Mars indefinitely, providing initial habitation space, though the capability to return to Earth with a Starship will be available. Given that the initial crews will likely need to reside on Mars for at least 26 months, self-sufficiency will be absolutely crucial. The base will need to be able to extract over 1 ton of ice per day to produce drinkable water and air for the base, with this ice needing to be both accessible and amenable to purification. This is another key area where in-situ resource utilization experiments on CLIPS and Artemis missions can provide valuable input for Mars Base Alpha's design. Self-sufficiency will also require the extraction and processing of minerals and metals, such that structural materials can be created for base repair and expansion. Back on Earth, during the build-up to each subsequent launch window, many additional starships will be launched into orbit. If we want to create a civilization on Mars, as many as 3 starships per day will need to be launched, assembling a fleet of 1,000 starships over the course of a year. The fleet will depart over a 30-day period when the launch window arrives, carrying tens of thousands of people to the Red Planet. The ultimate goal of this ambitious endeavour is to create a city on Mars with 1 million people by as soon as 2050. Designing such a city is one area where considerable work remains to be done. But one organisation that has been trying to fill the gap here is the Mars Society. In 2018, they announced a competition to design a 1,000-person Mars colony. The 100 entries contain some truly innovative designs, with the 22 most promising submissions recently published as a book. Right now, the Mars Society are running a second competition, this time to design a 1 million-person Martian city-state. Anyone in the world is welcome to submit a design before the end of June. So if you have an idea and you're interested, I'll post a link to the competition down below. Well, that brings us to the end of this Mars mission update. The return of human spaceflight to the US is an incredible achievement, but as we've seen, it is just one step in our journey. A decade of work realised this dream, and I wish all the best to Bob and Doug on their historic mission. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and please do let me know if you have any questions or comments down below. And never forget that our best days do truly lie ahead of us. Human ingenuity will always carry us through, and it will guide us as we venture out to explore the wonders of our solar system. If you enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy my Mars Bunker series, a collection of live streams exploring all manner of topics surrounding missions to Mars. To make sure you don't miss future videos, hit subscribe and click the notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest developments in our journey to the Red Planet.